A whisper in jade, a lie polished smooth, and somewhere beneath the rain, a ghost waits to be heard. This is not a tale of violence in the night, but of shadows that linger in porcelain and blood, of crimes buried beneath empire's pride. A single object opens a door to betrayal, grief, and a truth long silenced. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a sullen March morning in the year 1897 that I found myself once again seated opposite my old friend in the familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Outside, the clouds hung low over London like a mourner's veil, and the persistent patter of rain against the window panes provided a slow and mournful rhythm to the morning. Holmes had spoken little since breakfast. He sat amid a peculiar array of Chinese artifacts, lacquered boxes, porcelain snuff bottles, a carved ivory screen still half crated, all of which had arrived some days earlier, the origin of which Holmes had yet to divulge. He was leaning forward now, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed not on any one object, but seemingly into a distant and private fog of thought. Our silence was broken by a firm rap at the door below, followed by the familiar creak of Mrs. Hudson ushering someone in. Moments later, a figure appeared at the threshold, a woman, veiled and dripping wet from the storm, her gloved hands clutching a green velvet pouch, as if it contained something fragile or accursed. Holmes rose, with his customary composure, gesturing toward the chair nearest the fire. The stranger hesitated only a moment before accepting the seat, her trembling hands still wrapped tightly around the parcel. There was something in her manner, not fear precisely, but urgency tinged with deep unease, that caught Holmes' attention at once. She introduced herself in a voice that wavered just above a whisper. "My name is Eliza Hartley," she said. "My husband, Frederick Hartley, passed away 3 weeks ago." From the velvet pouch, she withdrew a singular object, a comb, green with age, yet gleaming faintly, carved in an intricate floral motif that hinted at great antiquity. She laid it carefully on the table before us. "It arrived at my door 2 nights ago," she continued, "without sender, without note, but I believe it is tied to my husband's past, and perhaps to his death." Her words faltered there. Holmes said nothing, but the silence that followed felt as taut as a drawn bow. With the delicacy of a surgeon and the reverence of a scholar, Holmes reached for the object. He held it to the light, turned it, sniffed it, even touched the tip of his tongue lightly to one edge, a gesture I had seen before in cases involving rare minerals or poisons. "Remarkably preserved," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "And not merely jade. This has the tint of river-cut nephrite, Qing dynasty perhaps, but no." He leaned in, peering at a nearly invisible fissure. "The work suggests imperial craftsmanship. Yet this edge, what is that doing there?" His voice had dropped into that curious register that meant his mind had already moved 6 steps beyond the rest of us. He placed the comb gently back on the table, his gaze fixed on it with uncommon intensity. Then, in a tone both sardonic and sombre, he said, "Some relics whisper, Watson. This one howls." I looked at him, expecting a trace of his usual flippant humour, but found none. There was a peculiar stillness in his face, as though some unspoken memory had stirred behind his eyes. Holmes was not a man easily discomposed by relics or symbols, yet I could not shake the sense that the jade comb, lovely though it was, had awoken in him something not quite analytic and not quite human. Mrs. Hartley sat upright now, her eyes darting between Holmes and the comb, as though unsure which held the greater danger. "My husband had business in Shanghai 20 years ago," she began hesitantly, "but there were things he never spoke of. But Holmes raised a hand. his expression now sharp and wholly present. "You need not continue just yet, madam," he said coolly. "Your gloves bear a faint scorch on the thumb, your hem carries red clay from the lower embankment, and the scent that clings to your sleeve is not your own. The shadows you seek to illuminate have already begun to cast their outline." He turned to me. "Watson, we are not at the beginning of this tale. We are, as usual, late to its middle." And with that, the case, whatever it was, had begun. Mrs. Eliza Hartley sat very straight in her chair, as though bracing herself against an invisible gale. Though her veil concealed most of her expression, the poise in her voice and the delicate way she removed her gloves suggested a woman of some self-possession, or one who had long trained herself to appear so. Her hands, I noted, trembled ever so slightly as she folded the gloves in her lap. Holmes offered no greeting, merely inclined his head and waited. "My husband," she began, "was Frederick Hartley of Limehouse, director of Hartley and Sons Shipping. He died on the 12th of last month." There was a pause. Holmes did not speak. "His death was ruled natural," she continued. "I had no reason to doubt it, until the object came." Her hand, still encased in damp kid leather, drifted unconsciously toward her bag. Holmes, eyes half-lidded, gave no reaction, but I felt my pulse begin to quicken. "It came 2 nights ago," she said. "No knock, no postmark, only an envelope, addressed to me in my husband's own hand." Or a very fine imitation. From the pouch she withdrew the jade comb we had already seen, but now she held it as if it might burn her. There was no letter, no name, only this. It was wrapped in old silk, and when I touched it, I noticed. She hesitated, then turned it to show a brown stain along the spine, fine and flaked. "Dried blood," she said quietly. Holmes remained still, his fingers steepled, gaze unreadable. "I do not know what it means, but my husband's affairs in the East were never clean. He said little of them, but I remember names. A man called Lennox, something about a ship, the Saffron Belle." She shivered. "He used to wake from nightmares, muttering of Jade and judgment. And now this arrives. A comb, foreign and obscene, laid at my door like a relic dug from a tomb." Holmes raised a brow at that, but still did not speak. I, meanwhile, felt the growing weight of the object, as though it brought not answers, but more shadows. The widow's voice, though carefully measured, carried the unmistakable timbre of dread. "In the weeks before he died," she said, "Frederick changed. He would sit by the parlour fire for hours, saying nothing, scribbling notes only to burn them the same evening. He dismissed our manservant with no explanation and stopped attending his club. He grew thin, not ill, just frightened, and still he would not speak of it. When I pressed, he snapped. That was unlike him." I could not help but glance at Holmes, who nodded imperceptibly, as though this confirmed something unspoken. "The night before he died," she continued, "I heard him arguing with someone in his study. I thought it was the wind at first, but the voices, there were 2. When I went in, he was alone. I asked if someone had visited. He lied. It was in his eyes." She pressed her gloved fingers together tightly. "And then, not a week later, the comb arrives. And with it, I believe, the very thing he feared most." Holmes finally stirred, leaned forward and said softly, "And yet it is not the dead who knock, Mrs. Hartley. It is only the living, wearing the mask of the past." "There were other things," she added. "Strange things. I began to hear footsteps in the garden at night. Once I glimpsed a figure watching from the edge of the hedgerow just beyond the gate." She spoke now more quickly, as if she feared she might lose courage. "I told myself it was the grief playing tricks, but one morning I found the latch undone, though I had bolted it. The footprints were washed away by rain, but I know someone was there." Holmes tilted his head slightly, almost as if listening to a distant melody. "And you mentioned nothing of this to the constable?" No, she replied. I feared they would think me mad, or worse, hysterical. Her voice tightened. Frederick kept secrets, but I will not let them swallow me. I do not wish to be the next Hartley to disappear into silence. A pause. That is why I came to you. Holmes rose and crossed the room. His movements were slow, but I knew better than to assume idleness. He stood beside her chair, glanced at her hand, her sleeve, the hem of her skirt. Your glove, he said at last. There is a faint scorch along the thumb, as though you reached too close to flame. She looked down in surprise. I had not noticed. You also walked through clay soil recently. Red, not local. Perhaps the garden path at Limehouse. She blinked. Yes, there's a slope where the ivy grows. And this scent, bergamot and rosewood, quite refined, but not of English origin. You wear no perfume, I believe. Never, she replied, frowning. Holmes stepped away. Very good, he said. Your silence speaks more than your words, Mrs. Hartley. It is not only your husband who kept secrets. She stiffened, but before she could respond, he turned abruptly and picked up the comb once more. You will allow me to keep this for study? She nodded. Then that will be all for now. Watson will escort you to your cab. And just like that, the interview was ended, though I felt, even then, that it had only just begun. When the door had closed behind her, Holmes stood at the window, his back to me. He held the comb delicately in both hands, as though weighing it for some secret balance. Tell me, Watson, he said at length, how much do you know of the Summer Palace? I confessed my ignorance. It was looted in '60 by Anglo-French troops, he said. Many treasures vanished. Jade, porcelain, imperial seals. This comb, I believe, belonged to the inner court, a gift of the Empress Dowager to one of her nieces. It was listed among the lost. I blinked. Then how could it turn up in Limehouse? Precisely, he said. It could not, or rather, it should not. And yet, here it is. He turned, eyes gleaming with quiet fire. This carving bears marks of the imperial style, the twin koi, the cloud motif, but see here, a seam, faint but present. It has been altered. He set it down. And blood, Watson. Blood on Jade is no accident. Something violent came with this. He folded his arms. Either Hartley took what was not his, or someone wishes us to believe that he did. His voice lowered. And both paths are equally treacherous. Holmes said nothing more that evening. He sat long after I'd taken my chair, his gaze fixed not on the comb, but on the fire's low glow. I had seen him in many moods, exhilarated, brooding, amused, but seldom so still. I ventured gently, "You believe her?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "There are objects, Watson, that do not simply enter a man's life. They return to it." His voice was quiet. "This comb is one of them." And with that, he turned his eyes once more to the Jade, as if waiting for it to speak again. It was 2 days after Mrs. Hartley's visit that Holmes suggested we pay a call upon Mr. Bernard Penfield, solicitor to the late Frederick Hartley. The man's chambers overlooked Bishopsgate, a narrow suite filled with ledgers and a pervasive odour of sealing wax. Mr. Penfield was a pale, bespectacled gentleman whose manner suggested a lifelong intimacy with contracts, not conspiracies. He greeted Holmes with the wary politeness of a man who suspects his visitor knows far more than he lets on. Mr. Hartley's legal affairs were, on the surface, orderly, he explained, drawing a thick folder from a cabinet. But I was once asked to smooth over a dispute involving a customs inspection in Shanghai. Quite discreetly, of course. The records are vague, likely by design. Holmes leafed silently through the folder. No mention of the Saffron Bell. Penfield hesitated. A shipping asset, held in trust, sold in '79. There were rumours it vanished for several weeks while docked in Amoy. And no inquiry was made? None that reached my office, the solicitor replied. Whatever occurred, it was resolved, with influence. Holmes handed back the folder. Indeed, influence, he said, his voice cool. Often the most valuable cargo on board. From Mr. Penfield's office, Holmes directed us to the Maritime Registry, a squat archive on East India Dock Road where the scent of damp parchment seemed a permanent fixture. There, among fading manifests and salt-stained records, we located the shipping ledger of the Saffron Belle. The entries were unremarkable until the year 1878. That spring, the vessel departed Calcutta under Hartley's charter, bound for Yokohama by way of Shanghai. Then, nothing. For 6 weeks, the records simply stopped. No docking logs, no customs filings, no listed crew activity. It resumed suddenly in Singapore, the manifest curiously altered, lighter by 20 crates. Holmes traced the entries with a fingertip. Here is your ghost ship, Watson. Not lost, merely hidden. What do you make of the missing cargo? I asked. A clever omission, Holmes said. The original crates are struck through with a different hand. The ink is fresher. A hasty forgery, and poorly done. He smiled faintly. When men erase what was never meant to be seen, they often leave behind a signature more damning than truth itself. I felt a chill, though the room was stifling. The Belle had sailed through silence, and something aboard her, it seemed, had never returned. It was Holmes' idea to track down the Belle's first mate, a man named Oswald Greevy, retired and living above a gin shop in Rotherhithe. Greevy greeted us with the wariness of someone long accustomed to questions best left unanswered. He was a thick-shouldered man with skin like dried rope and a voice sustained by salt and spirits. I remember Hartley, he said, pouring rum into a chip mug. And I remember Shanghai, filthy port. We took on crates there, carved boxes wrapped in silk. One of them split in loading, held some kind of green trinket, smooth as bone. A comb? Holmes asked. Could be, Greevy muttered. Didn't look long. That cargo, it wasn't listed. Hartley ordered us to stow it separate. Said it was consular business. And the Blue Orchid? Holmes asked, almost offhandedly. Greevy's hand tightened on the mug. Don't say that name, sir. That house was cursed. Everyone who passed through left changed, or didn't leave at all. Some said a woman ran it. Pale hands, black eyes. Holmes stood. Thank you, Mr. Greevy. Outside, I asked what he meant to learn. Holmes replied, Sometimes, Watson, the most useful truth is the one spoken under the breath, or slurred in rum. Our next stop took us to a cluttered little shop off Lehman Street, known to Holmes for its proprietor, one Mr. Ambrose Stenwick, a peculiar fellow who, despite his milky eyes, could identify the glaze of a Tang vase by touch alone. The man greeted Holmes with a grunt and a nod, motioning for the jade comb without so much as a word. He held it beneath an enormous iron-rimmed magnifier screwed to the counter, adjusting it with the care of a clockmaker. Summer Palace, he rasped after a pause. Imperial, late Qing, female court accessory, carved nephrite, very rare. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You're certain? Not many left, looted in the sack, 60. I've handled one before, slight chip near the spine. Imperial craftsman worked with a fault in the stone, masked it with the lotus carving. Clever touch. This one bears the same scar. Holmes leaned closer. Then this is no replica? Stenwick smiled thinly. Oh, it's been cleaned, polished, touched by unskilled hands. But the jade is real. The age, the artistry, unmistakable. He turned it over with a fingertip. This was taken from a palace, and whoever sent it wanted the memory to cut. Holmes took the comb back in silence, but his expression had changed, sharpened, as though the case had moved from curiosity to indictment. We had barely stepped beyond the shadow of Stenwick's shop, and Holmes paused mid-step and murmured, Keep walking, but do not turn your head. I obeyed, heart beginning to quicken. We are being followed. A man in a brown bowler, limp wrist, Turkish tobacco. I glanced subtly at a shop window's reflection and caught a glimpse of the figure, tall, hunched slightly forward, smoke curling lazily from his lips. Holmes continued, "Note the pacing. 3 steps behind, consistent interval, paid, not personal, likely hired to watch, not confront." "And what do we do?" I asked under my breath. "Let him have his illusion of secrecy," Holmes replied. "There is no better way to trap a spider than to let him think the fly is unaware." And with that, he hailed a hansom with studied indifference. "To Limehouse," he said cheerfully to the driver. "I feel like a cup of Dragonwell this afternoon." By the time we arrived in Chinatown, Holmes had transformed. Gone was the frock coat and pressed collar. In its place stood a mild-mannered gentleman of vague Eastern descent, his gait unhurried, his accent curious and clipped. I had witnessed his disguises before, but never with such startling subtlety. He led us to a modest establishment tucked between a grocer and a curio shop, the Lantern House, its entrance marked only by red lanterns and a faint trace of jasmine in the air. Within, the world changed. Low voices, steep teas, and a language of looks and nods. Holmes spoke sparingly, asking after old Jade, and invoking names I had never heard. Golden Crane, Iron Peeper, Liu of the Smokeless Pipe. There was deference in the replies he received, but also wariness. One man nodded at the mention of Liu, then poured tea with 3 fingers. A gesture Holmes later explained signified passage into restricted circles. "I do not expect candour here," Holmes whispered to me. "But in a house that trades in memory and myth, names carry weight." He sipped his tea. "And soon, Watson, one name will surface, the one that led Hartley to his grave." It came, as Holmes predicted, not from direct question, but from overheard confidence. A pair of grey-haired men at the table beside us spoke in hushed tones, their Cantonese too quick for me to follow, but Holmes, listening with apparent indifference, caught the drift. "Meiji Ren, Widow's Blade," he murmured softly. "A ghost name. What does it mean?" I asked. "A woman," Holmes replied. "Not by blood, but by vengeance. Said to reclaim stolen relics, not for money, but to balance scales unsettled since Empire's hand grew long." I shivered, not from cold, but from something older. A feeling that we had stumbled into a theatre of shadows, where players wore masks carved in grief and lacquered in blood. Holmes finished his tea. "If the comb was hers once, Watson, then we are no longer investigating a theft. We are trespassing in a legend." We exited the Lantern House under the weight of that name, but Holmes's mind was already turning. As we passed an alley by the silk vendor's stall, he slowed. "Wait," he said. "The beggar." I followed his gaze to a blind man slumped against the gate, tin bowl at his feet. Nothing about him seemed remarkable, until Holmes observed his left cuff is stitched in navy pattern, Royal Merchant Seaman's weave, and the soot under his nails, not coal, but opium ash. "You're saying he once ran a den," Holmes said coolly, "possibly the flower house of Greavy's memory, and if he listens more than he begs, he may know who took what and why." The beggar turned his face slightly toward us as we passed. Holmes dropped a coin without slowing. "We shall return, Watson," he murmured. "There are still ghosts clinging to that gate, and one of them may yet speak." It was the following morning that Mrs. Hudson, eyes wide and expression pinched, brought up a letter unlike any I had seen before. The paper was thick, pressed with faint floral impressions, and the address upon it written in a flowing, foreign hand. Calligraphic, angular, with no return direction, and a curious smell of sandalwood about it. Holmes held it at the corner as one might a venomous insect, and carefully broke the wax seal, which bore no crest, but an abstract swirl like waves or coiling smoke. He read it once, then again, slower. I caught a flicker of his brow, not of surprise, but of something colder, more calculated. He passed the letter to me without comment. The message was brief. No greeting, no signature, just 10 words, precisely spaced, inked with deliberate grace. The finger that holds Jade shall soon feel fire. I looked up. A threat? Or a proverb, Holmes murmured, depending on whether one is holding the jade or has stolen it. I asked who could have written such a thing. Holmes turned to the window. A scholar, a killer, a daughter, perhaps all three. And with that, he said no more for the rest of the morning. That night, long after the fire had burned low and Holmes had resumed his customary vigil in the armchair, a sound startled us both. A soft scrape at the downstairs lock, like a key turned without consent. Holmes was on his feet before I could speak, his revolver already in hand. We moved silently, Holmes signalling for me to remain near the stairwell while he approached the front door. There was a faint rustle, the whisper of cloth against brick, and then the door handle turned. It caught against the bolt with a muted clink. A pause followed. Then, hurried footsteps fading down the steps into the fog. Holmes waited a full minute before unlatching the bolt and stepping outside. He returned moments later, his expression unreadable. They came unarmed, he said simply. The mark on the latch was made with a bone pin. No scratches, only pressure. Deliberate, cautious. Were they attempting entry, I asked. No, he said. They were sending a message. And what message is that? Holmes looked down at the door, where a small curl of paper had been tucked into the frame. It read only, "There is no forgiveness in Jade." He folded it and placed it in his breast pocket. I awoke the next morning to find Holmes gone. There was no note on the table, no message left with Mrs. Hudson, and none of the usual signs that he had retired to one of his habitual haunts. His coat was gone, and with it the jade comb, which he had stored in his locked drawer beneath the Persian tobacco pouch. At first, I was not concerned. Holmes was known to vanish for days when a particular thread of logic took him across the city's less savoury districts. But by mid-afternoon, my unease had grown into genuine worry. I paced the flat, glanced often at the mantel clock, and caught myself staring at the chair where he had last sat, with that unreadable expression in his eyes. Try as I might, I could not banish the image of the note, the finger that holds Jade, nor the second. There is no forgiveness in Jade. They were not the words of a criminal, I thought, but of a zealot. And zealots, as Holmes had once told me, are not content with justice. They crave correction. When the bell finally rang at dusk, I leapt to answer it, but it was only a messenger, and not from Holmes. It was not until after nightfall that the door swung open to reveal Holmes, dishevelled, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light which signalled the chase had borne fruit. Without preamble, he tossed his coat over the armchair and retrieved the jade comb from his pocket. "I found its most recent owner," he announced, "a Mr. Avery Hotham, licensed antiquities agent with a penchant for discretion and cigarillos." "Where?" I asked. "Barnaby's auction house, Shoreditch," Holmes replied. "It came into their possession a fortnight ago, listed as unverified jade ornament, consigned by a private collector, but it was withdrawn the day before sale, without explanation." "Who withdrew it?" "Not who, what," Holmes said. "A letter, sealed with a red wax crest bearing crossed sabres, the mark of the Bengal Lancers." I frowned. "Military?" "Precisely. The same crest appears in Hartley's shipping logs. And the man known to have worn it during his Eastern deployment was Major Lennox, formerly of Her Majesty's Colonial Office, and, incidentally, once a rival of Hartley's in both commerce and affection." Holmes turned to the fire, his voice softening. "The jade was not merely a relic, it was bait, and someone wanted it to reach Mrs. Hartley's hands." I felt a chill run through me. "And who benefits from that?" Holmes smiled thinly. Whoever wants the world to believe her husband died with imperial blood on his hands. Once Holmes had settled by the hearth and lit a cigarette, he began to pace, a sure sign, as I had long learnt, that his mind was turning over some pattern too complex to sit still with. Lennox, he said, a man who once occupied the farthest reaches of empire with the air of a minor Caesar, stationed in Shanghai, 1876 to 1880, promoted after suppressing a smuggling ring, though those charges were notably thin and the evidence contradictory, returned to England shortly after Hartley's company took over the saffron trade route. I looked up. So he and Hartley were not merely business rivals, Holmes cut in. They were adversaries in a more personal sense. Hartley prospered where Lennox floundered. The latter lost not only wealth but position. And from what I've gathered, there was a woman involved, an interpreter of noble descent. Her affections, it appears, shifted to Hartley, which Lennox never forgave. Holmes nodded. Add to this the financial ruin Lennox suffered in 1892, when his investments in Ceylon plantations collapsed, and you begin to trace a rather bitter arc. A man dishonoured, impoverished and isolated, but still in possession of imperial contacts and a cultivated loathing for the man who supplanted him. And now, I asked. Now, said Holmes, his voice thin as the smoke curling from his cigarette. He sees in Jade the chance for retribution, cold, elegant, and untraceable. But there is more, Holmes added, turning to his writing desk. From the locked drawer he retrieved the comb once again, this time wrapped in a fresh cloth. He laid it upon the table with reverence, though his eyes held none. This, he said, is not the same jade comb looted from the Summer Palace. I started, but Stenwick said. Stenwick saw the jade, Holmes interrupted. The craftsmanship, but not the truth. The item is an exquisite forgery, Watson. The jade is genuine, yes, but the carving bears a subtle error. Look here, at the lotus motif. It lacks the curled petal, a flourish exclusive to the Empress's household, and beneath the lacquer, faint traces of resin, recently applied to age the surface. I examined the comb as he spoke, marvelling at the minute details I would never have noticed. And this, Holmes continued, lifting it with a gloved hand, has been laced. Laced. Poisoned, Watson. A rare compound derived from Galsemium elegans, a Chinese flowering plant. Odourless. Absorbed through skin. Prolonged contact leads to hallucination, then death. Crude but effective. I stared at him. Then, Mrs. Hartley was fortunate. The dosage is low, likely meant not to kill, but to unnerve. However, someone else was less lucky. He turned the comb, revealing a reddish-brown smear near the base. The blood was not her husband's. It belonged to whoever handled this without care. A thief, perhaps, or a messenger who learned too late that vengeance sometimes bleeds at both ends. He paused. The jade was meant to accuse, but the real crime, Watson, is yet to be committed, and we must reach it before it does. I have given the matter careful thought, Holmes said later that evening, and I believe our best course is not retreat, but invitation. Invitation? I repeated. There is a lecture tomorrow at the British Museum, he continued, on Qing Dynasty jade, delivered by Professor Edmund Clavell, an expert whose name appeared coincidentally in both Hartley's will and Lennox's investment papers. A trap, then. Precisely. He folded his hands. You, Watson, will escort Mrs. Hartley to the lecture as an interested friend of her late husband. I, meanwhile, shall observe in a less conspicuous form. You mean to disguise yourself again? I shall be a collector from Macau, Holmes replied lightly, eager to correct the learned professor on his misidentification of river jade versus mountain jade. That should keep me close to the stage. And what do we hope to draw out? The hand behind the threats, he said simply. Someone will be there, to watch her, to confirm that the comb did its work, and when they see she has not succumbed, they may move to finish what they started. He smiled faintly. Let us see, Watson, whether the fire promised in that letter is still burning. I will confess I did not sleep well that night. The notion of escorting a widow into danger, knowing she was being watched, perhaps even hunted, did not sit easily with me. Over breakfast, I voiced my objections. She's not a pawn, Holmes, I said. She's a woman grieving her husband. We cannot dangle her like bait. Holmes, sipping his coffee, did not reply at first. When he finally looked up, there was no impatience in his gaze, only a kind of distant certainty. She is not bait, Watson, he said. She is the bell. I frowned. The bell? He leaned back. Every trap has its lure, but a bell rings only when struck, and in doing so, it reveals who is listening. He set down his cup. She has agreed to come. She understands the danger, but she also understands that her husband's name hangs in the balance. I said nothing. Perhaps I could not. Holmes stood, already donning his coat. We are not leading her to a gallows, he added quietly. We are leading her to the truth. And in that moment, despite all my instincts, I followed him, as I always had, into the lion's mouth. It was a brisk afternoon when I arrived at the British Museum with Mrs. Hartley on my arm, the pale sky streaked with winter light, and the sense of anticipation curiously thick in the air. The widow was composed, if a touch pale, her mourning veil drawn neatly and her gloves clasped tightly around her bag. I could feel the tension in her step, though she said nothing of it. Inside, the east wing was alive with the soft rustle of overcoats and the murmur of scholarly voices. The assembled crowd was an odd mixture. Suited collectors with stiff collars and narrowed eyes, professors with dog-eared notes and ink-stained fingers, and here and there, the unmistakable air of diplomatic observers, well-pressed and deliberately silent. The lecture hall itself was arranged modestly, with a long glass case of jade artifacts displayed before the dais. I scanned the crowd for Holmes, but saw no trace of him. Mrs. Hartley and I took our seats near the centre, close enough to see the lecturer but far enough to keep a careful eye on the exits. Professor Clavell, a lean man with spectacles that magnified his pupils, stood ready at the lectern, shuffling a sheaf of note cards with a sort of academic preoccupation. He began his address in the usual manner. Introductory remarks, historical framing, mention of the Qing dynasty, and the imperial workshops of Beijing. But I scarcely heard him. I was watching the room, watching for a sign, any sign, that the trap Holmes had set was already beginning to close. It was 10 minutes into the lecture when I spotted him, or rather, failed to spot him, and only realized the omission a moment later. Toward the far end of the hall, seated near the wall, was an elderly Chinese gentleman, stooped with age and wrapped in several layers of silk. He appeared to doze, his white beard flowing over his chest, a cane resting lightly between his knees. But then I saw the eyes. Half-lidded, they scanned the room with a gaze as sharp as a falcon's, darting not with the indolence of age, but with the precise rhythm of calculation. He touched the edge of his cane twice, almost imperceptibly. I recognized it for what it was, a signal. Holmes, beneath an astonishing disguise, had taken his post. Professor Clavell had just reached the portion of his talk dealing with artifacts looted from the Summer Palace when the atmosphere in the hall shifted. Several heads turned at once, too quickly, too suddenly. Someone coughed. Someone else crossed his legs with excessive care. Mrs. Hartley, to her credit, remained composed. Holmes tapped the cane once more. Something was coming. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm when the trees grow still and even the birds hold their breath. Then, from the rear of the hall, I saw a figure rise slowly. Gloved hands, a high collar, and the unmistakable shimmer of a blade just visible beneath the cloak. The room darkened with such suddenness that it might have been orchestrated by the hand of Providence, or more likely, Holmes himself. The overhead gas lamps flickered violently, then died, leaving only the blue twilight filtering through the high, frosted windows. A murmur swept the crowd, followed by a single, sharp scream, not loud, but piercing in its brevity. I rose to my feet instinctively, but Holmes was faster. In the dimness, I saw him move with astonishing swiftness for a man in apparent dotage. The sound of chairs scraping, whispers rising, and a general rustle of panic filled the space. Mrs. Hartley sat frozen, her eyes wide, hands clenched at her lap. I reached to steady her, then saw the figure from before, the cloaked one, now moving down the aisle, headed directly for us. The glint I had seen beneath the cloak reappeared. Metal, surely. A knife or something like it. There was another scream, closer this time, and then a commotion near the display case. Glass shattered somewhere to our left. Suddenly a beam of light cut through the haze. A lantern lit from the wall by some museum attendant, or perhaps Holmes himself. It was enough to cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, and in that flickering light, I saw Holmes drop the cane, rise to his full height, and begin to move. Not as an old man, but as the hunter he had always been. With the fluidity of a dancer, Holmes surged forward and seized the cloaked figure's wrist just as the blade came free. There was a cry, not of pain, but of fury, and the attacker twisted violently, revealing not a man, but a woman beneath the hood. Her eyes were bright with rage, and she struck out with remarkable speed, aiming not at Holmes, but at Mrs. Hartley. The blade, curved and ivory-handled, was inches from its target when Holmes pivoted, using the woman's own momentum to send her crashing into the front pew. Gasps erupted all around us. Several men lunged forward, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Holmes remained still, standing over her, his disguise torn partially aside, the white beard askew, but his expression cold and utterly composed. "She was not here to kill," he said calmly, "only to mark." I knelt beside the woman as two constables finally arrived, summoned no doubt by the earlier alarm. She did not resist. She looked past us all, straight at Mrs. Hartley, and said in a voice both bitter and beautiful, "The Jade was not his to give." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, meet Miss Lee May. She claims the comb as her birthright," he continued, "and she was being used, not by Hartley, not by his widow, but by a man who wanted her fury pointed elsewhere." He straightened his cuffs. "And now, I believe, we have drawn him out." The woman stood tall now, the cloak discarded and her face revealed beneath the dim museum lanterns. She was not yet 30, and though her garments bore the mark of travel, her bearing was regal, her expression unwavering. Her voice, though accented, was precise and sharp as broken crystal. "You English take what you do not understand," she said, addressing no one in particular. "My grandmother wore that comb on the day the palace gates fell to fire. You say he gave it in love? He gave it as a trophy." Mrs. Hartley looked as though she had been struck. "My husband would never—" "Would he not?" Miss Lee May snapped. "Then how did it come to your hair and not hers? The Jade of the East is not for Western locks to bind." Holmes had said she was being used, and yet as I watched her, I could not shake the impression that her anger was not feigned. It pulsed from her in waves, not rage alone, but grief barely held in check. She turned to Holmes. "You know it is mine. You saw the crest, the imperial blossom carved on the base." Holmes gave a slight nod. "I saw more than that, Miss Lee. I saw a comb that bears witness to theft, yes, but not the theft you suppose." She stiffened. "You mean to say he did not steal it?" "I mean to say," Holmes replied, his voice cool as frost, "that you were shown a comb and told a tale. Both were false, and the man who told them was neither Hartley nor honest." The crowd pressed in now, Curiosity mingled with confusion, but Holmes, as ever, was only just beginning his unspooling of the truth. Holmes adjusted the lapel of his coat, now entirely free of his former disguise, and surveyed the watchers with calm command. "Miss Lee May," he said, "your pain is not in question. What is in question is the architect of that pain." She opened her mouth, but Holmes lifted a single finger. "The comb you saw, the one delivered to Mrs. Hartley, is a fabrication, a clever one, but not clever enough. The jade is local, not Manchurian, and the toxin soaked into its base is derived from Aconitum ferox, native to Nepal, not found in any palace in Beijing." A murmur passed through the room. "It was crafted to appear imperial," Holmes continued, "but its workmanship bears the unmistakable signature of a London artisan. You were shown this comb not in Beijing, but in a townhouse off Limehouse Docks, by a man who called himself Roth. That man," he turned, "was Major Lennox, formerly of the Bengal Artillery." Miss Lee's face paled. "He knew of your lineage, of your grief. He cultivated it, fed it with tales of Hartley's desecration, and then he armed you with a false relic and a mission." She staggered back, stunned. Holmes nodded once. "You were meant to discredit Hartley's name by way of his widow. But what you sought, the real comb, he never had, nor did he claim to." A silence fell, pregnant with realization, and Holmes, with his hands clasped behind him, prepared to pull the final thread. Holmes drew from his pocket a folded document, yellowed at the edges and brittle with age. He held it aloft. "This," he said, "is the manifest of the Saffron Belle, a merchant vessel out of Calcutta that made port in Amoy in the spring of 1878. Among its listed cargo, porcelain, tea, silks, and one jade comb of imperial provenance." He allowed the silence to lengthen. "This log was thought destroyed. In truth, it was concealed, tucked in a locker at the Pall Mall Officers' Club, rented under the name Edward Lee, another of Major Lennox's aliases." Inspector Lestrade, now edging through the crowd, took the ledger with a grave nod. "It bears not Hartley's signature, but Lennox's. He was the one who removed the comb from the smouldering ruins of the Summer Palace. He falsified customs entries, buried the cargo's true value, and passed off the tale of Hartley's looting years later when convenient." Miss Lee's hands trembled. Holmes turned to her with a gentler voice. "Your cause is not without justice, Miss Lee, but justice is not vengeance, and the man you nearly stabbed is not your enemy." He paused. "Nor was her husband." Mrs. Hartley let out a soft, shaking breath. She had said nothing through it all, but now her gloved hand clutched the edge of a chair as though for support. Holmes's gaze swept the room once more. "There remains only one thing left undone," he murmured, "and I suspect he is already moving to avoid it." The shift was slight, the rustle of a coat, the faint scrape of boot against tile, but Holmes had heard it. In one swift motion he turned, leaping past the final row of chairs toward the rear vestibule. "There!" he cried. "Lennox!" The man who had posed as an observer in diplomatic garb was already halfway through the exit. His beard was askew, his hat low, but his gait betrayed him, hurried yet practiced, a soldier's retreat. Lestrade sprang after Holmes, and I followed with what vigour I could muster. We caught them at the base of the museum's eastern arch, where the marble columns met the mist of late afternoon. Holmes had Lennox by the shoulder before the man could descend the steps. The struggle was brief. Lennox attempted a punch, which Holmes dodged with characteristic ease, before Lestrade brought down his cane smartly on the man's wrist. He yelped, then sagged. "I wondered when you'd find the ledger," Lennox muttered, bitterness thick on his tongue. Holmes regarded him coolly. "It took longer than I'd like, but falsehoods have a habit of leaving fingerprints, especially on Jade." Lestrade snapped the cuffs into place, and the crowd, now spilled onto the portico, gasped and murmured. "Your war was over," Holmes said softly. But you couldn't accept peace. You wanted Hartley's legacy in ashes. Instead, yours is. And with that, Major Lennox was led away beneath the cold gaze of history and the impassive marble above. We returned to Baker Street under skies the colour of pewter, with the events of the museum still settling in my mind like stirred silt in a glass of water. Holmes, however, was possessed of that strange serenity which often overcame him after a case had reached its apex, a calm not of relief, but of intellectual satisfaction. "Sit, Watson," he said, motioning toward my old chair. "You've earned your tea this afternoon." He busied himself at the corner table, where the lamp always burned low even in daylight, and where the apparatus for tea stood beside his chemical retorts with the same permanence as if part of a shrine. The kettle hissed. He moved with precise economy, like a man conducting a ritual he did not worship, but understood entirely. I, on the other hand, found myself restless, unable to reconcile Miss Lee May's haunting accusation with the calm, almost academic way in which Holmes had dismantled it. "You're remarkably composed," I remarked, "given that a woman nearly stabbed our client on the basis of a false relic." Holmes poured the tea, no sugar in his own, 2 lumps in mine. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when one has anticipated the thunder, the lightning is less startling. What remains is merely the rainfall of facts." He handed me my cup. The jade comb, the scream, the ledger, the girl, all parts of the same mosaic. Let us now, if you please, look at each tile in order. Holmes drew a small velvet pouch from the inner pocket of his coat and tipped its contents into his palm. The comb, or rather the thing that had masqueraded as one, gleamed with a dull green sheen under the gaslight. "Observe," he said, holding it toward me, "the tool of both deception and conviction, a humble object, and yet it bears 3 unmistakable signs of falsehood." He gestured with a thin metal pointer he used for minute work on slides. "First, this edge here. See how it reflects. That is not the surface wear of time, but of resin polish. No artifact of the Qing court would have such treatment. Authentic jade, when used by imperial hands, is never glazed. The stone itself is considered sacred, and its texture, unaltered, is part of that sanctity." I leaned in, squinting at the edge. "It does catch the light oddly." "Indeed. Secondly, the characters carved into the base." He turned it to reveal the calligraphy, meant to resemble the seal of Empress Sixi's household. But if you note the second character, the carver has mistakenly chosen the simplified form used in common trade inscriptions, not the court variant. A forgery of carelessness or of foreign ignorance. "And the third?" He held it near my nose. "Smell." I did. Faintly, but undeniably, there was something chemical and not at all ancient. "Almonds," I murmured. "Cyanogenic compounds," Holmes confirmed. "Residual trace of the poison used, most likely aconitine or a cousin compound, soaked into the porous backing, crude but effective. And above all, silent. The comb's greatest lie was not its origin," he said, placing it gently down, "but its silence." Holmes settled back into his armchair, his fingers steepled. "The blood, of course, was the clue," he began. "Had Mrs. Hartley been the victim of some midnight mishap, there would have been evidence elsewhere, a bandage, perhaps, or complaint of injury. She had none." "And it wasn't her husband's?" I asked. "Certainly not. The blood was too recent, and the comb had only arrived a week prior. Moreover, the volume was trivial. It was not indicative of violence, but of clumsiness." He leaned forward slightly. "It was Lennox, or rather, the hand that placed the comb into the silk case. He nicked himself, likely on one of the sharpened tips, while preparing the replica." He rose and retrieved a folded note from the mantel. "There was a message with the comb, was there not?" I nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Hartley said it had a single line, from a friend of your husband's past. She assumed it was poetic." Holmes handed me the note. Not poetry. Strategy. Lennox meant to invoke ambiguity. He counted on her uncertainty, on her grief. He hoped she would either ignore the comb or display it without suspicion, thus exposing herself to May's vengeance. I exhaled, the threads tightening into clarity. He risked everything on a careless cut, I murmured. He risked more than that, Holmes replied. He wagered his whole grievance on a poisoned hair ornament and a woman's mourning. It was a bold move, but as we now see, not a wise one. Holmes stood once more, the restlessness of deduction still in his limbs, and crossed to the window. He looked out not at the street, but at something beyond, a memory perhaps, or an idea. Major Lennox, he said at last, was a man soured not by dishonour, but by obscurity. Hartley returned from China to applause, to invitations, to quiet respectability. Lennox returned to silence and a desk in the War Office. And in that silence, a narrative grew. Jealousy, I said. Not merely that, Holmes replied. A conviction that he had acted rightly and Hartley had merely profited. The truth, that neither man was saint nor villain, could not comfort him. He required a myth in which he was the betrayed hero. He turned back towards me. Thus the comb, a relic of an empire already decaying, twisted into a weapon against a widow. And Miss Lee May? I asked. A pawn, but a brilliant one. Lennox needed authenticity, and she carried it in her voice, her bearing, her grief. He gave her a false comb and a true injustice, the ruin of her family's artifacts, and let her fury do the rest. Mrs. Hartley's reputation, I murmured, was to be destroyed in polite society by whispers and scandal. Holmes nodded. And with it, Hartley's legacy. That was the goal. The man was already dead, but Lennox wished him forgotten. There was silence between us for a time. Then Holmes added, almost to himself, "We think ghosts come from graves, but in truth, they are born from bitterness." Holmes turned once more to the letter which had accompanied the poisoned comb, that single-folded slip which Mrs. Hartley had dismissed as cryptic ornament. He handled it with the delicacy of a man unwrapping a hieroglyphic. "The seal," he said, pointing with his long, pale finger, "is the heart of this tale." I leaned closer. The wax was a deep oxblood, flattened rather carelessly, with only a partial impression remaining. "You recognize it?" I asked. "Not at first," Holmes admitted, "but something gnawed at me. The arrangement of cross pennants, the faint arc of a regimental motto in bastardized Latin. And then, while you were napping yesterday, I consulted the file on the Ardmore affair. The scandal in Assam?" I asked, startled. "The very one. In 1878, Colonel Lennox, then a captain, was accused of misappropriating regimental artifacts during the retreat from Chengdu. Nothing was ever proven, of course, but he had a signet ring with this exact crest, a gift from a Chinese general with whom he'd shared a hunting expedition. It was removed from his finger when he was dismissed." "But why would he use that?" I asked. "Why leave behind a mark so easily traced?" "Because," Holmes said, "men driven by vengeance often court recognition more than caution. He wanted the Hartleys, and the world, to know someone had accused them, but not who, not just yet." And then he smiled grimly. "The vanity of villains is the investigator's best accomplice." Holmes rose and moved to the cluttered side table, brushing aside a mound of correspondence to retrieve a folded sheet. It was printed on cheap stock, a merchant's inventory, stamped in red. "The Lantern House," he said, "a nondescript tea house in Limehouse, patronised by dockworkers and exiles. It appears in Mrs. Hartley's cheque stubs. She'd visited the place 3 times, purchasing gifts for her late husband's old comrades." I blinked. "And Miss Lee May?" "Signed the delivery register with an alias, M. Ling, a name I've seen before, in the Registry of Independent Traders. She imported Formosan tea under that name. But curiously, She listed a Kensington address that belongs to no house, merely a postbox. Holmes placed the two documents side by side. Now observe the handwriting, the ledger from the Lantern House and this merchant entry. Identical flourishes on the L, same abbreviated NG. You deduced her true name from that. From that, and the ink. The tea house ledger uses a local blue-black ink, while the merchant registry shows bleeding from a diluted foreign mix. The same May used to address the envelope containing the comb. My head spun. So she was never just a wronged noblewoman. She was already watching. Indeed, said Holmes. And if Lennox sought to weaponize her pain, he vastly underestimated how pain sharpens rather than dulls the blade of intellect. Then she knew the comb was false, I asked. Holmes merely sipped his tea. It was some time before I found the courage to voice the thought that had been gnawing at me since the museum. You used her, I said quietly. You let her believe the comb real. You knew she would come for Mrs. Hartley. Holmes set down his cup with care, though not delicacy. I did not let her do anything, he said. She arrived at the truth by her own path. I merely laid the stones. But she might have killed. She did not, Holmes replied, because her goal, like mine, was never blood, but clarity. I stared at him. That seems a fine distinction. Holmes's eyes, cool and grey, met mine without apology. Watson, to rob a woman of her family's truth is cruel. To return it with precision is a mercy. I gave her the direction, not the impulse, and she chose to follow the story to its end. I could find no ready reply. There was truth in what he said, though I could not like it. Holmes rose, and as he stood at the window, he murmured, Some lies are kind, others merely convenient. I prefer the ones that, when undone, leave something worth understanding. Holmes kept a cabinet, tall, mahogany, and faintly scuffed by decades of silent trophies, in the far corner of our Baker Street sitting room, though many might assume it contained mementos of academic pursuit or musical study. I knew better. That cabinet was a reliquary of riddles, a shrine to the peculiar and the grotesque. And now, on a wet afternoon, heavy with the smell of coal smoke, Holmes opened it once more. He handled the jade comb without ceremony, though not without reverence. It was wrapped in soft muslin and bore, still, the faintest glimmer of deception in its false polish. He placed it beside the Vatican snuff-box, a dull silver relic with secrets far older than the Pope who had once signed the order to recover it, and the ivory fan from Athens which had once fluttered over a widow's gilt in the Corinthian sun. Do you keep them, I asked, as reminders of triumph or of warning? Neither, Holmes replied, latching the door with a click. I keep them because every story leaves an echo, and it is best to know where the echoes sleep. I said nothing. The rain at the window murmured agreement. Holmes remained at the window longer than was his habit. His eyes, so often scanning for movement or meaning, now seemed unfocused, as though he were watching something neither outside nor present. I cleared my throat, reluctant to break the quiet. Holmes, I said at last, do you ever wonder whether justice truly extinguishes the sins it touches, or does it merely catalogue them? He turned slightly, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. You mean the sins of empire, Watson? I nodded. We chase relics and revenge through continents, jade combs and ivory fans, but the dead do not write letters of thanks. No, said Holmes, but they sometimes leave footnotes. He turned back to the window. The streaks of rain traced lines down the pane, like ink running down the edge of a confession half written and never sent. Artifacts, Holmes said softly, are the bones of forgotten crimes. I glanced up, startled by the sharpness in his tone. They do not merely survive, he continued. They accuse, not with shouts, but with silence. A forged comb, a misdated fan, a snuff-box traded during a siege. Each carries within it a whisper of conquest, a shadow of the hand that stole, forged, or silenced. You believe the object itself bears blame. Not blame, Holmes corrected. Memory. He crossed the room, fingers lightly brushing the edge of the cabinet. We imagine crimes exist only in blood, but some are carved in porcelain, some in treaty, and some in the space where one name should have been written and another was placed instead. He looked at me then, and for once, his eyes betrayed something not unlike weariness. It is a strange thing, Watson, to converse daily with ghosts and call it deduction. A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Mrs. Hudson entered without waiting for reply and placed a telegram on the mantel. Holmes, without haste, retrieved it and unfolded the crisp paper with a flick of his fingers. His eyes scanned the message once, then twice. He said nothing but passed it to me. The handwriting was hurried but legible. Ashes found in locked room. Help needed. L. I looked up at him. Inspector Lestrade? I asked. Holmes only resumed his seat and poured a second cup of tea. Outside the rain lightened, but only slightly. The silence that followed was not uneasy, but heavy, as if something had just ended and something else had begun. Holmes stirred the fire absently. The flames reflected briefly in his eyes, making them seem far older than his face betrayed. So many ghosts, Holmes, I murmured. He did not look at me. Yes, he said, and every one of them waiting to whisper in jade, ivory, or blood. The comb, now sealed behind glass, caught the firelight for the briefest moment, and then faded, like memory itself, and thus ended the affair of the jade comb. For now. Holmes sat silently by the hearth, fingertips steepled beneath his chin, eyes unfocused as if peering into some distant battlefield of the mind. The jade comb lay nestled among the relics of older cases, silent, yet speaking volumes. Empire, Watson, he said at last, is less often built with glory than with the careful concealment of shame. This comb, like so many trophies of conquest, told a lie long after its thief had vanished. I stared into the fire, and yet truth still finds its voice. Holmes allowed himself the barest smile. Indeed, though sometimes it must borrow jade to speak. What do you think was the criminal's gravest miscalculation? The forged artifact, the manipulated grief, or the assumption that Holmes would be fooled by history's dust? Let us know what you believe was the turning point in the case. Don't forget to subscribe for more timeless mysteries from Baker Street. And if you enjoyed this story, share it with a fellow lover of classic detective fiction. The game's afoot, always.